how is the brain interpreting information and how is it responding to information and how do I understand it from that approach that then allows my brain to not have to focus at my toes and allows me to focus on what I really need to be focusing on in the world.
Mhm.
Because if I have my toes hurting, nothing else is going to happen. If you try and tell me my toes don't hurt because your toes don't hurt with socks, now I feel discredited
Mhm.
and can't then understand my world.
Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD. This week, I am so genuinely pleased to introduce everybody to a colleague of mine, Tami Eller, who I heard speak on the topics that we're going to conversate about today in a presentation to several graduates of facets training of facilitators. And it just was a really, really good information that I want to share with everybody. So, Tammy, welcome to the podcast.
To be here.
So glad to have you. So, you had spoken with us about how a diagnosis often becomes just a label. And truly, a diagnosis is nothing but shorthand, right? It's a 1 to 3 word label that is a shortcut. And when we think of that, when we hear that word, we're supposed to be able to unpack a lot of information. And when there's none of that wealth of information, then it truly is just a label and can cause great disservice to a great number of people, no matter what that diagnosis is.
Mhm.
So, in your mind, how are some ways that we can move beyond the label when we're referencing fetal alcohol spectrum disorders?
I think the interesting part about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is that if you've met one individual with FASDs, you've met literally one individual with FASD. There's so many complexity that goes into how that prenatal exposure has impacted the brain that every single one of us have very unique brains. It's the label is just saying we are somewhere on a very broad spectrum. And you could almost like plot all of us on that spectrum and you would have very little overlap.
Mm.
And I mean, there's millions of people impacted across the world with FASD. And so thinking about kind of the complexities and the intricacies of how everyone's brain is different. Now there's similarities. So the diagnostic write-up that goes into that label is where I call it gold. That's where you're mining for the gold because that's going to tell you how I'm impacted differently than how you are impacted and how another friend of mine is impacted or a colleague is impacted. Only for how do we understand both how my brain is impacted differently and then also how my brain isn't impacted. Can we individualize? How do we support someone to be successful and whatever that looks like for them? Recognizing right what they want to do to be successful. How do we support them there?
I think, Tammy, I would take that a step further by bringing in the fact that this is a whole body diagnosis. It's not just the brain, because if we have comorbid physical conditions along with that that are chronic, that creates a whole spectrum of stress in its own right. And that affects how our brain works as well. It affects our mental health. For instance, with my diabetes, if my sugar falls too low, then I can't think straight. Those synapses do not connect, right? Or if it's too high, then I feel like a slug and I can't process anything, not because I can't, but because it takes too much energy. I'm just tired and feeling like crap. Those things are also a part of why we look so different one from another.
I think that's, a really interesting part you just made as we've evolved in our understanding of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders over the last 50 some odd years now. We're just having a better understanding of how everything's converging. It's really interesting because I think what keyed everyone to my differences really was the fact that I was failure to thrive and my brain wasn't growing. I had a tiny little head and I had like feeding issues and all of these more physical symptoms that kind of keyed in that I needed support. Some people don't have those early symptoms and they have more of kind of those behavioral symptoms. And then as we age, you start to then say, oh, but there was this and there was this and there was this. And like you said, that brain fatigue that
Mhm.
happens is super important. And so by providing accommodations, we can also ensure that the brain isn't having to use as much resources that would typically go to the body. Then we also don't stress out the brain, cortisol dumps, which also impact autoimmune disorders and all of those pieces to the puzzle that you really have to look at that brain body connection. I really sadly don't think we've done enough research to really truly understand what that looks like. We're just getting there. Thank God for our colleagues up north of us who said, wait, there's something here. We need to research it.
Mm.
I'm not sure how much it's really truly understood within
Yeah,
the field of medicine.
yeah. One of the gems that we learned in facets was that a fully functioning brain still uses 25% of our energy. And that's a pretty significant drawdown when the brain is what, 3% of our body weight,
Yep.
using that much. But when we are having to put so much additional effort in to do everyday things, then we very quickly empty that fuel tank.
Yes.
And by the end of the school day or the end of the work day or the end of any task that requires a significant amount of focus, we can be completely drained and not prepared to do anything else in our
Yeah.
day.
Yeah, and that's very true. Actually, that's 25% for adults. When your brains are still growing and learning in childhood and adolescence, it's up to 60%. People wonder why kids might be craving sugar. It's really to get those sugar levels up so that they can continue to function. And so that's, that recommendation of, complex carbohydrates and protein every 2 hours is critical for some of us to make sure that
Mhm.
we do have those stores, specifically younger kids, but even adults. If we're hungry, we're also stressing the brain out. Some of what you're talking about, I think, is also making sure that we are keeping the brain out of fight, flight, and freeze, because if our brains aren't, whether that be through food sources or my sensory needs being met, or having expectations that I can realistically live up to, that all supports me preserving my energy and my brain being able to function well so that I
Mhm.
can then get through the day or get
Yeah.
through the week without crashing. And that really goes back to how am I impacted uniquely than you or to someone else, and what would that look like? And then how do we provide accommodations for that? It isn't until we get those diagnostic write-ups that we even really truly have an understanding of what that is.
Yeah. And I remember some of the other little tidbits that were shared with us during that time is how our bodies use nutrition differently,
Mhm.
which has a lot to do with that energy drawdown that we are faced with every day. And the stories about kids that would come home from school and they would go straight to the sugar bowl or they would go straight to a stick of butter. Both of those things will elevate sugar levels very quickly and give those kiddos the energy they need to get through the afternoon until dinner time. Yeah.
Exactly. And I
So,
think there's this added element that we often don't think about, which is that brain body connection with interoception of, do I even recognize I'm hungry? Do I even recognize I'm thirsty? Some of us struggle with that because of how our brains were impacted. And so
mhm,
we might be completely exhausted on empty, and yet we may not recognize those cues because of how our brain's been impacted. So it's really important for caregivers to be mindful of that, or also as we age, for us to be mindful of that and go, okay, have I eaten recently? Have I had some water recently? Because we may not cue into our body
right.
systems in the same way that others do.
Right. And by the time we experience thirst, we've already 10% dehydrated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I think this really goes to helping utilize individuals' own experience to help them put words into how that translates. And I think a neurotypical brain that can function well in society with very little supports because society is built to manage the world in that way. There's a loss in translation between how my brain interprets and how their brain interprets information. How we translate that is really important. When I was little, I'm super tactilely defensive. I remember I was raised by my grandma and my grandpa. And I went to my grandmother and I'm like, my socks hurt me. Right? And socks
Mhm.
shouldn't hurt. Like,
Yeah.
they like right, and so my grandmother wasn't tactily defensive, and she's like, "How do socks hurt?" Right? And then I remember I pulled on, her son's hockey, socks that he would wear under his hockey uniform, which are like thick terry cloth socks, right? And I was like tiny little kid, and they probably went all the way up through, top of my thighs. I was like, these don't hurt. And so what she realized was that I could feel the seam at the toes on socks. And in those
Mhm.
I couldn't because and so what I learned is I needed socks where I couldn't feel the seam. And it was like, okay, now we just find socks. And I have very vivid memories of her going through, wherever we were buying socks and her opening up the package to make sure that they were terry cloth, because if they weren't, she was going to buy socks and I wouldn't be able to wear it.
Yeah.
And so these are ways to like think about when they say something, not just be like, that's ridiculous. Look at it from a neurobehavioral lens and go, what could make something like a sock painful, right?
Mhm.
So it's those pieces of going, okay, how is the brain interpreting information and how is it responding to information? And how do I understand it from that approach? That then allows my brain to like not have to focus at my toes and allows me to focus on what I really need to be focusing on in the world.
Mhm.
Because if I have my toes hurting, nothing else is going to happen. If you try and tell me my toes don't hurt because your toes don't hurt with socks, now I feel discredited
Mhm.
and can't then understand my world. And then I start to internalize that.
Yeah.
And so when we think about mental health, we can provide opportunities for really great mental health by allowing individuals to understand their brain and then also validate without judgment or shame that, okay, your brain works a little bit different. We
Mhm.
can find ways to make that still work in our society. Right. And it's not always as easy as changing out socks. I get that,
Yeah.
but that's like one simple example of step back, go, okay, we know someone's brain's a little bit different because of prenatal exposure or genetics or whatever the cause is. And what is that telling us about how their brain works?
That can be with any of the senses as well. I know that, and also this is a way that our symptoms can change and evolve over the years because as a child, as a adolescent and young adult, excuse me, I did just fine in noisy environments, dancing at the club, excuse me, going to a shopping mall, there's stimuli overload in both of those.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Now that I'm in my 60s, oh, heck no. I'm not doing either one. Oh, I have a tickle in my throat. But, so that's a change. But now riding, for instance, and riding in the pickup with my husband, he likes the radio up louder, but he's often in noisy environments where there's a lot of heavy equipment. So he needs the volume higher. He likes the TV volume higher. And if I'm in the truck, it feels as though I'm being assaulted. And I find myself pressing into the seat as if I could disappear. At home, if it's the TV, I just say,
Yeah. Well, you can also remove yourself if you needed to, whereas in a
right,
truck, you can't necessarily. And
right,
I think what's often not understood is we sense danger through our sensory system. And so
very
if our
right,
sensory systems are not regulated, we are going to be in a point of fight, flight, and freeze. And we know that the majority of individuals with prenatal exposure will have sensory processing differences.
right.
And so if we do not meet our sensory needs, then we will figure out a way to get them met. So if I have to avoid, right, the seam in my sock, I will just take off my socks, right? Or if I can't do that, then I will probably go into fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm much more likely to go into a freeze response. That's just my
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
Now, but that's not everyone's response because I might go into more of a fight response if I need proprioceptive or vestibular because that would balance it out. If I'm a
Yeah.
seeker in those ways, then I'm more likely maybe to start punching or pushing or right to do, and then that could then help balance out my sensory avoiding and regulate. And so oftentimes, once again, this misinterpretation of what is happening from this lens of that they don't necessarily need the same stimuli can then be stigmatized and shamed when reality is I am just trying to regulate and you're not understanding that. So how do you help me regulate in a way that is helpful for both you and me, right? So it's how do we look at it from all of those different angles
Yeah.
is really important.
And we can be both sensory seeking and sensory avoidant, even with the same type of stimuli. For instance, so many kids, especially in foster care, they leave their coats everywhere. Now, I would think, and it's not because they don't realize it's the access to clothing is could be limited depending on the foster parent's situation, but I think it's that lack of ability to perceive the cold. So when they
Right.
go out the door, it doesn't they don't the cold does not register, so there's not that initial prompt that says there's not a biological prompt that says go in and get your jacket. On the other hand, and I used to do that. Well, I didn't lose my coats and jackets, but I would walk to school as a child in 20-degree weather wearing nothing but a cotton knit cape
Ooh,
and be totally fine. And yet, okay, say for instance, pain. Now, some of us don't feel pain. I have broken bones and not felt pain, but I also have chronic pain conditions where I very much feel pain. And so it's both things at the same time, which is very, very confusing to people.
I think that's one of those areas that's almost fairly unique to prenatal exposure. And I think the other piece is when you think about the sensory system, that is really developing very early on in the brain. And so we're talking about pretty early on prenatal exposure to alcohol, although even later exposure can also impact sensory systems. But like, so yeah, and it can go kind of like on a dime too, right? So I can be seeking, 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 and now I'm avoiding really quick. And
Mhm.
processing speed can kind of play a little bit into that to where
Absolutely.
interoception and my processing speed. So I'm seeking, 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 but because I don't have the same interoception that maybe someone else does, I don't realize I've hit my threshold. And now I'm over my threshold and it's kicking in. And I'm like, whoa, now I have to back off. And so that confuses the daylights out of individuals,
Yes, it
which is
does.
part of why, to me, I think the first level of support for individuals with an FASD almost needs to be occupational therapy
Mhm.
because of that bottom up support from, neurosequencing from bottom up support so that we can then go into our frontal lobe. And we can only develop frontal lobe if we are able to support the rest of our brain
Mm,
first.
yeah.
And so many of the behavioral health therapies, and I say this in all honesty as a mental health clinician, only really meet the needs of the frontal lobe. And so, so many individuals with an FASD are not getting their needs met within behavioral health therapy because it's so heavily focused here when a lot of the support needs to be in our sensory system and regulation in that area before we can even move up.
Right, right. And for viewers, you might want to, if you watch on YouTube, you might want to check out the playlist on primitive reflexes and developmental work. So, because OT really is the go to modality for working with FASD. But
Definitely.
it's hard to access. Occupational therapy centers don't take all forms of insurance, or they will take private insurance, but not take state insurance. and they are looking at narrow diagnoses, and once again, FASD tends to not make those lists.
Yeah, and they also have different pay structures depending on what the diagnosis is and what the treatment is. And, and I think these are these system issues that we consistently run into
Yeah.
that are really frustrating.
Yeah. Okay. So this is my 3D model of spectrum. Hopefully, we'll be presenting it in Seattle. If not, I'm sure the FASD United will be able to use us somewhere else. But it seemed to me that any kind of spectrum, but especially FASD, there's such a disservice from a linear concept of what spectrum means with, high and low functioning,
Yeah,
because we are far more complex than that. So
exactly.
on this rendering, each facet is another, it's a form of, an aspect of our functioning in daily life. So it could represent a particular cognitive challenge, or it could represent a physical challenge, or it could represent a developmental delay, or all the different things that are unique to each individual. And I wanted to use push pins, but the program I used, they didn't have it. So I had to use golf flags. Not my best work, but I've got to find someone who can redo it.
I
But
really like that a lot.
yeah. So, the idea is to think of us as being three-dimensional beings. And, in totality, we're so much more complex than could ever be conveyed on a line.
Yes.
And I think that also explains why when neurocognitive testing is done on our kiddos, they're always returned as we can't help you. The findings were scattered. We can't make sense of this. It doesn't match any pattern. Well, this is why.
Exactly, and I think the other variability to that is and so I talk about, like, spoon theory, right? And so we only have so many spoons in a day. So maybe on Friday, I came in with 5 spoons, but because it's Friday and I've already had to do 4 days of work, my spoons aren't quite as big as they were on Monday, and now by Friday evening, if you were to test me on Friday evening, I'm not going to do near as well as maybe I would have halfway through Monday.
Mhm.
So it's that piece of and that also really confuses individuals is I'm not getting which is why it looks like defiance so often.
Yes.
So what I can do on Friday isn't near as good as maybe what I can do on Monday.
Mhm.
And it's because of I have had to work my brain so confuses not I think those who are around. I know I get frustrated with myself on days and I'm like, man, I just can't find that word. I know what the word is. I can see the word. I can feel the word on my tongue. It is not coming out. I can tell you
Yeah.
the definitions. I can tell you synonyms.
When you know the word will come to you as soon as you're out of the situation.
Yes. Right. And you're like, "But I needed it." Yeah, and I think or you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, "There's a stupid word."
Yep.
Yes, and so it's these pieces that just make it so confounding for individuals, and therefore we get more and more labels put on it. And none of those labels are helpful, like,
Exactly.
you know, I and not that, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, if we only use it as a label or any of the diagnoses underneath the spectrum,
Mm.
because in the United States, our spectrum has different diagnoses at different points. Other countries don't do it that way. That alone is not helpful. It is how how is my brain different? How is my body different? All of that is helpful. And then help my support team know how to meet me where my brain is at and my body is at, and then help me learn how it's different so I can advocate for what I need when my support team's not around in ways that people will listen to me and hear me. That is what is important.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
Tammy, how old were you when you learned you had FASD?
Yeah. So my grandmother they explained it to her when I was between 6 and 9 months old because I was failure to thrive. And also, I think recognizing I was born in Anchorage, Alaska, right? And so if you think about the connection between Anchorage, Alaska, and University of Washington, we have a very strong connection. And it was late 70s, and my grandmother was very open with why she was having to raise me. And not that at that point in my mother's life she wasn't in her addiction, but she was well on her way to going there. I mean, she was
Mhm.
17, didn't find out she was pregnant till 15. She was doing what 17-year-olds in Alaska did in the 70s, which often involved a lot of substances
Yeah,
and alcohol was at the top of the list, right?
yeah,
So when I wasn't growing and they were very concerned about my head not growing because your head, if it's not growing, then the concern is it will crush your brain. What we don't often talk about is as the brain grows, it also causes your skull to grow, which is why you have those moving plates.
right,
So why we measure the head is to make sure the brain's actually growing. And so if you have less cells, your brain's going to be smaller, which is why you look
mhm,
at that for FASD. So my it just wasn't. And so finally they're like, this is what we think is going on. And so someone once asked me, when did you find out? And I think the reality is I don't remember when I found out because there was always this conversation of that's probably hard for you because of this. And that's probably this is why. And so, and I never felt that it was stigmatizing
mhm,
because of this belief that my grandmother and my grandfather too had that Tammy isn't doing something just to piss everyone off. If
mhm,
she's telling you she can't do it, there's a reason she can't do it. And it's your responsibility to figure out how to support her, which
mhm,
honestly
mhm.
probably irritated a lot of people. But that's okay because what it allowed me to do is have those accommodations when I needed them
Yeah,
and have and then right, and then my brain wasn't quite as stressed as it could have been, which
yeah,
then allowed my brain to grow and
yeah,
change. And I also was living in a very, I had privilege. And I feel lots of individuals, so early identification, maybe not the best type of services because it was the 70s, but at least this recognition of, okay, if her socks are hurting, that's not ridiculous or something there. If she's holding her pencil wrong, it's because she has underdeveloped muscles in her hand because I have those hands that are super tiny, right? So let her hold her pencil differently. Stop trying to badger her to hold it the right way, right? If she needs music, let her listen to music. Like those types of things.
wonderful that they advocated, so strongly for you, so successfully for you.
Yeah.
And I think that I had lots of clues as an infant and young child that nobody realized meant anything,
Mhm.
because I was born in 1963 and,
Mm.
10 years before FAS was discovered. My mom used to always enjoy telling the story of, like, all my life, people have teased me for eating slowly. And my mom enjoys the story that even as an infant, I ate slowly. And she would complain that she would be sitting in a rocking chair nursing me for so long that by the time I drank enough for a decent meal, it was time for the next feeding again. And she just roll her eyes and just, that's just the way you were. You've always been like that, But what we now know is that because she was continuing to drink 1 or 2 drinks a day, that I was getting drunk, so of course I was falling asleep. Oh,
And we also know that midline is very impacted by prenatal exposure. So oftentimes infants don't have the same sucking
mhm,
ability as if they
yeah,
weren't exposed. And so it could have been a combination of both.
yeah,
And so if you don't have a strong suck, you're not pulling out as much milk.
right.
And if you have to work twice as hard to get that milk, that's exhausting. So there could have been like that piece and this piece too
Yeah, all
happening.
3 of those pieces. Yeah,
Yeah. And I think this is where I am happy that I hit the right state at the right time to get identified.
yeah,
Yet I also have a lot of sadness that in some places we are still in 1963 America
mhm,
where people didn't really know anything
yeah,
because of the stigma that is around alcohol use in women and it being someone's fault instead of recognizing that no one intentionally hurts someone. And by perpetuating that stigma of this was that person's fault, when really it was the chemical's fault, that we're not then giving education enough so
Right.
women can make well-informed decisions
Yeah.
for themselves and their child. And then afterwards, we don't want to ask because then they might not tell the truth because there's
To
shame
avoid
there.
the stigma.
Yep.
Yep.
And it makes maybe us uncomfortable because we might have to reflect on ourselves and our choices. And so we just get youth labeled and labeled and labeled without a real understanding. And they start to internalize that. And and that's where my heart just breaks, like literally breaks.
And I mean, I'm always talking about how we cannot blame women for using a legal substance before they even know that they're pregnant.
Yeah.
When it's already done damage. It's just not fair, especially when it's something that our society embraces wholeheartedly. That's just totally unfair to them. But do we stop to consider that perhaps any particular woman has a doctor or midwife who gives them the bad advice of a glass of red wine is fine? If it's going to keep you de stressed, then it's going to be less harm than, having to give that up and manage all your daily stressors, whatever. I guess you could say well intentioned, but very dangerous and very bad advice.
Well, and I think the medical, yes, I think yes, completely agree. And it's amazing when I start reading articles. Honestly, I get mad every single time I do. And I start reading comments. It's amazing how many within the comments there are medical professionals defending why alcohol isn't really a big deal. And I want to be like, how do I know more than you know? So I think it's also like, why is the information not being given to medical providers? And I think honestly, it's because we use very abstract blanket language. It causes damage or it causes birth defects. Well, if you have a healthy baby that's 7, 8, 9 pounds and they have all their fingers and their toes and
Enough.
that then that their heart rate's good and you're not seeing any then they don't have birth defects. And
Right.
so it isn't until we start seeing them, I call them the cliffs that they fall off of, right? So we see a cliff in kindergarten, things get harder, cliff falls off there. Then you have second and third grade, a cliff there, sixth, seventh grade, a cliff there. And by junior year, if those haven't been supported, we have this really big cliff as they're being pushed into adulthood and they may not make it well. I like literally years in this field, we see those cliffs very significantly and they gain new diagnoses, new treatments. And if the providers don't get it at that point, yes, they're not meeting the needs of the brain, then things just get worse. So, but no one then goes back and says, well, could it have been this over here? So I think those are the pieces I want to just kind of be like, why aren't we giving them the facts in medical school? This is what it does to the brain. This is what it does to the body. Alcohol kills cells. We know that. Like, that's why you swab your arm before you get a shot. What?
And and the cells that don't die are changed,
Exactly. And what does that look like?
right?
So why aren't we giving them the hard data so that instead of just these very blanket statements that are very arbitrary and abstract when we could be giving very concrete
Right.
information?
Or the statement that, well, so and so was prenatally exposed to alcohol and they're just fine, but that goes back to, if you know one person with FASD, you know one person with
Yeah.
FASD. But in reality, when, if the current rate is 7.1%, that's 1 in 14, we all know a lot of people with FASD, regardless of whether they know they have it. And that right there shows you that the struggles are so diverse, the impacts are so diverse.
I remember early in my career, I was sitting at a conference of infant and early childhood educators, and there was a woman in talk they had just left a presentation on FASD, and she was like, "I don't really get this." She goes, "My mom drank with my brother and he's completely fine. He just has ADHD." And I was like, "Do I tell her or do I not tell her?" And I was like, really early in my like, so today, later, 20 years later, I would be like, let's have a conversation because that might actually be fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and not just ADHD, because we know so many have that as a co-occurring disorder diagnosis.
Isn't it like 90% of us?
80. Well, and it's usually the very first diagnosis someone receives. And it traditional treatment doesn't usually always work well. And so then it kind of starts this cascading impact. So I think it's these pieces of, and I feel like I was like 20 years ago, I should have been brave enough to said something, because what about when she got pregnant? She might have thought it was not a big deal. And now she may have had a child who's impacted. So, but it's those pieces that I think so many individuals are out there labeled with something
Mm.
and may not be understanding how they're truly impacted and not getting the support that would allow them to lead lives that might be more fulfilling for them. They wouldn't have to feel that shame and blame
Right, right. And that
internalized.
and when we grow up not identified or diagnosed, we still hear those messages of shame, blame, and punishment for our differences, which we can't help, but we end up internalizing them and repeating that same language, judging ourselves harshly. And that to me is one of the benefits of adult diagnosis
Okay.
because it allows us to reframe our struggles and challenges throughout life and give ourselves grace. So, um, so you had also talked about the myth of independence.
So my clinical work has always been primarily with youth who have been part of the child protection system.
Mm.
And oftentimes those youth who are part of that system and experience prenatal alcohol exposure are the ones who struggle the most and then end up aging out of the system. And there's this push for them to go into independent living. And the expectation is you'll get a job, you'll have your own place to live, you'll be paying your bills, and you are independent.
And they're
Um,
supposed to master all those tasks between the ages of 18 and 21.
if you live in a
And
state that's extended foster care, yes, not all
right.
states have that.
Right.
Yeah,
And yet I can tell you that managing on call for those young adults, the types of calls we would get would be for things that we normally would hear from a neurotypical 11-year-old,
exactly.
10-year-old, 12-year-old. And yeah, most social workers were just so enormously frustrated by that. And even I was, it's like, oh, I got to get up and out of bed for this. But it's developmentally, it's where they were at. And to expect them to function independently by 18 or 21. Yeah, it's not very realistic.
Well, and so that led me to these thoughts. I was having these same thoughts that you were, and I was teaching facets, and one of the places in facets is the values exploration, and one of those is what now we don't call it dismaturity anymore, but that dismaturity piece of the brain takes longer to mature because the brain doesn't have as many resources, so it just takes longer. Makes sense. But those expectations of society is age expectations based on chronological age. And I was held back a year. So I graduated high school at 18 and I literally left for college because you always fly out of Alaska on a red eye. Turned 19 and got on an airplane to fly to college. And I was like, how is my experience different from these? And I realized I wasn't independent at 19. Now I thought I was. Thought I was pretty hot, you know what, in living, but I moved into a dorm. The only thing I was responsible for cleaning was my little teeny tiny part of my dorm room and managing that with my roommates. My laundry I was responsible for, right? I didn't cook my meals. I had a meal plan. In fact, the university managed our meal plan service that they allocated a number of points every week that I could spend on my meal plan because they didn't want us to eat all of our meal plan points in 1 week, right? And then I had one bill. Now, this was the 90s, so it was a phone bill. I didn't have a cell phone. It was my landline to keep in touch with my family.
Mhm.
That was my launch into we had a health center that I didn't even need insurance for. All I had to do was walk in, and if I was experiencing some kind of illness, they would treat it. They had dispensary for like a pharmacy on that we could get our medications from. Like everything was handed to me in a package. I had an RA, so if we had a major life crisis, they were older. Heck, they even had a huge envelope of condoms for those of us that were sexually active to practice safe sex that we didn't have to purchase. All of these pieces were handed to us. Our university had police. Let me tell you, we got into some shenanigans that if I was living in the real world, I probably would have maybe got myself into trouble for. But we didn't because we had university police that kind of protected us. Now, of course, if there had been something huge, it would have been different. But I'm talking about like shenanigans that if I did in downtown Anchorage, the police might want to be like, let's get you into some trouble, right? So all of those things I think are like microdosing adulthood. And that's a privilege. And everyone celebrated how independent I was without really looking at the fact that we weren't independent. We were interdependent on a system of care that developed because they knew that 18, 19, 20, 21 year olds needed that level of support to be able to,
And that's even neurotypical 18,
yes,
19, 20-year old.
exactly.
Yeah.
So if neurotypical 18, 19, 20 year olds need that level of support to be independent, I am sorry, but we are like holding individuals up to an expectation that is completely unfair, inequitable, and not realistic. And then we blame them for their failures. And to me, that is just horrendous.
Yeah.
And the parents also feel that. I must have did something wrong. My child's not launching into adulthood.
Yeah.
Right. I have to explain why Johnny's living with us still at 19 and doesn't have a full-time job yet. I didn't have a full-time job in college. Right. I went to school and then I worked a few hours here and there for like pizza money. And that
Mhm.
was it. Like I wasn't working 40 hours. So I just really want to break this myth of independence and normalize interdependence as being vital for everyone's success, whether or not you're neurotypical or have some neurodivergency.
There's something about Americana, right? That one of our society's key values is independence, but none of us are independent.
No,
We don't make our own clothes, we don't grow our own food. Well, some of us do, but I'm not one. I don't have a green thumb, I have a black thumb.
me
Everything
too.
that I try to grow dies, and just, it either of dehydration or drowning. I just can't get it right.
Don't remind us to feed them. I can take care of a dog, a cat, children, because if they get hungry or thirsty, they're going to let you know. A
Mhm.
plant, by the time they let me know, they're dead.
Yeah. But, none of us are as independent as we think.
Nope.
So it is a very good idea to embrace interdependence and realize and recognize and honor those people that support us in various capacities and who we support in various ways as well. So,
And I think it
well,
then breaks that stigma of and allows people to be open to it because if I concretely think of independence and that is what you're giving me to be without looking at all the nuances, then I am going to feel like a failure. But if I can understand the nuances or it's just provided for me, then it goes back to that core belief system of I am good, I am valued, I am precious, I have worth, all of those pieces that we want to build into people.
yeah, yeah. Regardless of whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, that's what we always want to pour into our children.
Exactly.
or our neighbors' children, right? And
And our adult, like
yeah, to one
everyone.
another.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Tammy, thank you so, so much for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And yeah, what an honor to have these conversations and to normalize things that sometimes people are just fearful of or anxious about or judgmental about, but it's all just part of our humanity, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I appreciate this opportunity for to be here. And I just am very happy to meet you, a fellow individual that also is impacted. And I think it's important for us to share our stories
Hmm.
to let people know that what the media portrays for someone who's impacted is not the full story.
Yeah. It never is.
Exactly.
It never is. The media can't do anything right because everything gets altered for their idea of a good storyline.
That's a good point. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you once again for joining me on Living with FASD. And I'd love to have you back sometime.
That would be awesome. You have a wonderful day and thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you.
I am so glad that you tuned in to today's candid conversation, and I hope you found it very valuable in adding to the breadth and depth of your knowledge about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. I also hope we made you laugh along the way. I'm so honored to bring you these candid conversations week by week, and I'm so grateful that you keep coming back. You are my faithful audience, and I'm so grateful for you. Please reach out to me at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com. If you have suggestions on topics you want me to cover, that you want maybe to learn more about, or guests that you think would be excellent to invite to be on the show, I'm always happy to get your suggestions. And I'm also happy to hear if any of these episodes have touched your life. Please share your story with me. You never know, I might invite you to come on the show. If you want to pick up a copy of my book, Sip by Sip, Conversations with Adults Living with FASD, you'll find the ordering links in the show notes, along with my Calendly link if you want to schedule a complimentary call to talk about any training or coaching needs that you might have that I might be able to help you with through my company, Casper's FASD Life Coaching and Training LLC. Now, if today's guest has given me contact information to share and you want to reach out to them, that information will also be in the show notes. So in the meantime, I just want to thank you again for taking time out of your busy week to watch or listen to this podcast on whatever platform you have found me on. And please, please, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast so that others can find it. That's how they find it, is when you share it. And the more people that find the podcast, the more people learn about FASD and the less hidden we are. So that's it for today. It's a wrap. Have a great week, everybody. And we'll see you next time on Living with FASD. Take good care.